There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed as a Tuesday evening, a shared pizza, a movie neither of you is really watching. You let them in without a second thought, because you've seen them 100 times before. But then they take their coat off, and underneath, they are a fulcrum, a turning point, a before and an after. You don't recognize them for what they are until much, much later, when you're looking back and trying to pinpoint the exact second the world tilted on its axis. For me, that moment wore the face of my roommate, Noah, asleep on my chest, his breath a warm, rhythmic tide against my collarbone. It felt less like a moment and more like a geological epic, a silent, slow-motion continental drift that had finally, terrifyingly, brought our two land masses together. I lay perfectly still on the old leather couch, a prisoner of a fragile, perfect peace. Every part of me was a study in stillness, a statue carved from bone and held breath. Only my heart refused to cooperate, hammering a frantic, muffled rhythm against my ribs, a desperate Morse code that I prayed he couldn't feel. He'd been asleep for over an hour, a dead weight of trust and exhaustion pinning me to the cushions. His hand was curled loosely against my sternum, his fingers limp, the dark hair of his head a soft chaos against the plain gray of my t-shirt. The television was still on, casting flickering blue and orange ghosts across the walls of our small living room, the sound muted. We had started the night on opposite ends of the couch, a demilitarized zone of worn leather and throw pillows between us, a space we had both silently, meticulously honored for years. But sleep, like water, obeys its own laws, and it had eroded those boundaries without a sound, pulling him incrementally closer until he had finally collapsed against me, a fortress surrendering to a siege of sheer fatigue. I was a photographer. My life was about observing, about capturing fleeting compositions of light and shadow, about understanding the story told in the space between things. And for the last 4 years, the most compelling subject of my study had been Noah. I had cataloged the way his eyes crinkled when he truly laughed, the specific cadence of his footsteps coming down the hall, the thoughtful frown he got when he was trying to debug a line of code. I knew him in pixels, in apertures and shutter speeds. I knew the version of him he presented to the world. Charming, confident, a whirlwind of social energy. And I knew the version he kept hidden, the one that emerged late at night, exhausted and quiet. The one who sometimes looked so profoundly lonely it felt like looking into a mirror. But this was a new composition. This proximity was a depth of field so shallow that everything else had blurred into non-existence. The only thing in focus was the weight of him, the scent of his shampoo, the impossible, agonizing fact of his body resting against mine. My affection for him was an old wound, a thing I had learned to live with, like a dull ache in a joint that only flared up in the cold. I had packed it away, wrapped it in the gauze of practicality and the splint of self-preservation. He was my friend, my best friend, and he was, as far as I had ever known, completely and unshakably straight. To risk that friendship for a feeling that had no chance of being returned would have been an act of self-destruction. So I had become an expert in the art of platonic intimacy, learning the precise calibration of a supportive shoulder pat, the acceptable duration of a friendly hug, the exact distance to maintain to keep my own heart from staging a full-scale insurrection. But this sleeping, trusting surrender on the couch wasn't in my carefully curated vocabulary. It was a new language, and I was terrifyingly illiterate. He shifted, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and his fingers tightened on my shirt for a bare second before relaxing again. My entire nervous system flared, a citywide power surge. I felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled upon a perfectly preserved, impossibly fragile artifact. One wrong move, one sudden breath, and the whole beautiful, terrifying thing could crumble into dust. And as I lay there, trapped and soaring, I started to trace the path back, trying to understand how we had ended up here, in this quiet, charged space between before and after. We had met in the way so many people do in college, through the gravitational pull of a mutual friend. I was a quiet sophomore in the visual arts program, my world largely confined to the chemical-tinged air of the darkroom and the hushed halls of the art history library. Noah was a junior, a bright, loud spark in the computer science department, a guy who seemed to collect friends as effortlessly as he breathed. He moved through the campus with a kind of kinetic grace, always in the middle of a laughing crowd, his energy a palpable force. He was the sun. I was a planet in a distant, quiet orbit, perfectly content with my solitude. Our mutual friend, Sarah, insisted we would get along, a claim I found dubious at best. She brought him to a small gallery opening where I had a few photographs on display. I remember standing awkwardly in a corner, nursing a cup of terrible wine, watching him work the room. He spoke to everyone, his smile easy and genuine, his interest seemingly inexhaustible. He was everything I was not. When Sarah finally dragged him over to me, I was braced for 5 minutes of polite, strained conversation before he was pulled away by a stronger social current. But he stayed. He actually looked at my photographs, his head tilted, a thoughtful expression replacing his social smile. They were stark, black and white images of urban decay. Peeling paint on a warehouse door, a single weed growing through a crack in the pavement, the skeletal remains of a pier against a foggy sea. They were quiet and, I suppose, a little melancholy. Most people glanced at them, murmured something vaguely complimentary, and moved on. Noah was silent for a long time. I was just about to make a self-deprecating joke to break the tension when he finally spoke. "It's like you found the places where the world is holding its breath," he'd said, his voice softer than I'd heard it all night. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and curious, and for the first time, I felt seen rather than just observed. That was the beginning. Our friendship didn't explode into being, it seeped. It started with him asking for my help on a flyer design for some coding competition, then escalated to late-night study sessions in the library where we would sit in companionable silence for hours, the frantic tapping of his keyboard a counterpoint to the quiet scratch of my charcoal pencil. We discovered a shared love for terrible science fiction movies and a mutual disdain for the campus dining hall's mystery meatloaf. He would drag me out of my self-imposed exile to parties, where he would act as a kind of social buffer, always checking in, making sure I wasn't drowning. In return, I became the person he came to when the noise got to be too much, when the pressure of his own relentless energy finally wore him down. He would show up at my dorm room door, looking frayed at the edges, and just sit on my floor while I worked, the silence a balm for him. We were an unlikely pairing, the extrovert and the introvert, the man of logic and the man of light. But somehow, in the space between our two extremes, we found a perfect, comfortable equilibrium. The realization of my feelings, the moment the dull ache first flared into a sharp, undeniable pain, came about a year into our friendship. It was the end of the spring semester, and a group of us had gone to the coast for a weekend before finals. We'd spent the day on the beach, a chaotic mess of frisbees and laughter and sandy towels. As evening fell, someone built a bonfire, the flames painting our faces in flickering shades of orange and gold. Noah had been dating a girl from his department, Jessica, for a few months by then. She was nice, pretty, smart, a perfect match for him on paper. I watched them sitting together, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. It was a picture of casual, happy coupledom, and it should have been nothing more than that. But then Noah looked up, his eyes scanning the group, and he caught my gaze from across the fire. He smiled, a small, private thing, just for me, a silent, "Are you okay over there?" check-in. And in that instant, watching the firelight dance in his eyes, the vast, impersonal roar of the ocean behind him, something inside me fractured. It was a profound, seismic shift, the kind you feel in your bones before you hear the sound. I suddenly wanted, with an intensity that stole my breath, to be the one he was holding. I wanted to be the reason for that easy, protective curl of his arm. The feeling was so powerful, so absolute. It felt like a betrayal of the very foundation of our friendship. I spent the rest of that night in a state of quiet panic. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and walked down to the water's edge. The cold waves lapped at my ankles, the salty air a shock to my lungs. I looked back at the fire, a tiny island of warmth and light in the vast darkness, and felt a chasm open up between me and them, between me and him. I was on one side, with this new, terrible knowledge, and he was on the other, in a world where I was just his friend, his buddy, Liam. That night, I made a conscious choice. I took this dangerous, beautiful, impossible feeling and I buried it. I dug a hole in the deepest, most fortified part of myself, and I packed it down with layers of pragmatism. I told myself that his friendship was a gift, a rare and precious thing, and to risk it would be the height of selfishness. I could live with the ache. I couldn't live without him. From that day forward, I became a master of sublimation. My photography grew deeper, more melancholic. I poured all the yearning, all the unspoken words, into my work. My camera became my confidant, the darkroom my confessional. I watched him fall in and out of love, offered him advice on Jessica, listened to him talk about their future, and with every word, I cemented another stone over the thing I had buried, hoping that if I built the wall high enough, I might one day forget what was on the other side. After graduation, the decision to get an apartment together felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our lives were already so intertwined, our rhythms so synchronized, that living separately seemed impractical. We found a two-bedroom place in a quiet, older building with good light and thick walls. It became our sanctuary. The architecture of our apartment mirrored the architecture of our relationship. My bedroom was my space, cluttered with camera equipment, books, and prints in various stages of development. The air smelled of fixer and paper. It had a door with a lock that I rarely used, but its presence was a comfort. Noah's room was the opposite. Neat, minimalist, organized with the clean logic of a coder. His desk was the centerpiece, a command station of monitors and ergonomic chairs. The living room was our shared territory, the neutral ground where our two worlds merged. It was where we ate takeout on the floor, where we debated the merits of Star Trek versus Star Wars, where we lived our life together, side by side. The boundaries were unspoken, but clear. We were roommates, best friends. We respected each other's space, each other's privacy. It was a system that worked. It kept me safe. It kept the thing I had buried from ever seeing the light of day. For 4 years, it worked perfectly, until the night Noah's world, and by extension, mine, started to quietly fall apart. The shift didn't happen with a bang. It was a slow leak, a gradual deflation. Noah and Jessica had been together for almost 5 years, a fixture in our lives. I had long since made my peace with her presence, relegating my feelings for Noah to a kind of background hum, a static I had learned to tune out. Jessica was a good person, and she made him happy, which was, I had convinced myself, all that mattered. Their breakup was not the dramatic, door-slamming affair I might have imagined. It was a quiet, mutual erosion. They had been drifting apart for months, their shared future slowly becoming two separate paths. The final conversation, as Noah later recounted it in clipped, hollow sentences, was more of a sad acknowledgement of an ending that had already occurred than a decision to end it. It was amicable, mature, and utterly devastating for him. He came home that night, and I knew instantly that something was wrong. The usual energy that radiated from him, that low thrum of a finely tuned engine, was gone. He walked in and dropped his keys on the small entry table with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. He didn't say hello. He just walked past me into the living room and sank onto the couch, staring at the blank television screen. I followed him, my own heart a nervous bird in my chest. I sat down in the armchair opposite him, giving him space, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I could feel his misery like a drop in barometric pressure, a physical weight in the air. I didn't push. I just sat with him, my presence a silent offer. After what felt like an hour, he finally spoke, his voice raspy. "It's over," he said to the television. "With Jessica." "I'm sorry, man," I said softly. It felt horribly inadequate. He just nodded, a short, jerky movement. "Yeah, me too." He didn't want to talk about it. Not then. He just wanted to not be alone. So we sat there until late into the night, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. That night was the first crack in the carefully constructed wall of our friendship. I wasn't just his friend offering support. I was a witness to a kind of profound unraveling. He seemed smaller, stripped of his usual charismatic armor, left with a raw, quiet vulnerability I had only glimpsed before. He was adrift, and without consciously realizing it, he had reached for the nearest shore, which happened to be me. In the weeks that followed, the change became more pronounced. The breakup had unsettled something deep within him. He threw himself into work, coding until the early hours of the morning, but it was a frantic, joyless effort. He stopped going out with his usual crowd. His laughter, when it came, was thin and brittle. The most noticeable change, however, was his sleep, or lack thereof. He confessed one evening, rubbing his eyes, that he couldn't seem to turn his brain off at night. He'd lie in his perfectly neat, quiet room and his thoughts would just race. He started looking perpetually exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes that even his morning coffee couldn't erase. The vibrant energy that had once defined him was replaced by a kind of weary restlessness. He began spending more and more time in the living room, our shared space. He would bring his laptop out to the couch, claiming the light was better or that he needed background noise. I knew it was an excuse. He didn't want to be in his room, alone with the silence and his thoughts. He needed a presence, an anchor. And so, night after night, I became that anchor. I would sit on the armchair, editing photos on my own laptop, the quiet clicks of my mouse a companion to the tap-tap-tapping of his keyboard. We were together, but separate, a silent pact of shared solitude. It was in this new, fragile landscape of his loneliness and my silent, watchful care that the ritual began. The ritual started, as most significant things do, by accident. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday, one of those indistinguishable weeknights deep in the heart of a long, cold autumn. Rain was lashing against the windows, a relentless, percussive rhythm that seemed to amplify the quiet inside our apartment. Noah was sprawled on one end of the couch, his laptop balanced precariously on his chest, his face illuminated by the screen's cold, blue light. I was at the other end, a book open in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in half an hour. I was watching him, the way his brows were furrowed in concentration, the weary set of his jaw. He'd been trying to solve a particularly nasty bug in his code for hours, and the fight was clearly going out of him. His typing slowed, then stopped. His head began to nod, his blinks growing longer and longer until, finally, his eyes slid shut. His head drooped forward, then jerked back up. This happened 3 or 4 times, a sad, silent battle against a tidal wave of exhaustion. Finally, the tide won. With a soft sigh, his body went slack. His head lolled to the side, coming to rest with a soft, almost imperceptible thump against the cushion right next to my thigh. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked into place. It was the slightest of touches, just the pressure of his head through the thick fabric of his hoodie and my jeans, but it felt like a brand. My entire consciousness collapsed into that single point of contact. I could feel the warmth of him, the faint vibration of his breathing, my own breath caught in my throat. My first instinct, a panicked, self-preservationist urge, was to shift away, to break the contact, to restore the boundary. It would be so easy. A simple readjustment of my position, and the space between us would be reestablished. He was asleep. He would never even know. But I couldn't do it. There was something so unguarded, so deeply trusting in the gesture, even if it was accidental. Moving away felt like a rejection, a cruelty he didn't deserve. So I stayed. I sat there, rigid and unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, my book forgotten, my own body a landscape of screaming nerves. The rain beat its steady tattoo against the glass. After an hour, maybe more, I dared to look down at him. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, his face looked younger, the lines of stress and worry smoothed away by sleep. A lock of dark hair had fallen across his forehead. Without thinking, my hand lifted, my fingers twitching with the insane urge to brush it back. I caught myself just in time, snatching my hand back as if I'd been burned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had survived the accidental touch, but the near-intentional one almost undid me completely. That was the first time. A week later, it happened again. This time, he didn't even pretend to be working. He came out of his room around 11, looking hollowed out. "Can't sleep," he mumbled, and collapsed onto the couch. We put on a movie, one of our old sci-fi favorites, the dialogue a familiar comfort. Halfway through, I felt his weight shift. I didn't have to look to know what was happening. He leaned into the arm of the couch, then slowly, incrementally, his head found its way to my shoulder. This time it felt less accidental, more like a sleep-drunk homing instinct. He settled in with a small, contented sigh, and my entire world tilted again. I spent the next 2 hours as a living statue, my shoulder and arm slowly going numb, a pins and needles fire spreading down to my fingertips. I didn't care. The discomfort was a small price to pay for the terrifying, exquisite privilege of his closeness. I was becoming a cartographer of these new territories, mapping the weight of his head, the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle shifts in his sleep. The ritual began to evolve, to escalate, following a dreamlike logic that I was powerless to resist. The couch became the established setting for this unspoken routine. He would come out to the living room every night, under the thinnest of pretexts. My room feels stuffy. I think I'll just watch something out here. Mind if I crash on the couch? I never questioned it. I would just nod, my heart performing its now familiar frantic ballet. I would take my usual seat, and he would take his, and we would wait. The waiting was a form of torture and bliss. I would pretend to read or work, every nerve ending attuned to him, waiting for the moment when sleep would finally dissolve the walls between us and pull him across the chasm. It became a nightly prayer. Sometimes he would end up with his head in my lap, my hand resting awkwardly on the cushion beside his face. On those nights, I barely breathed. I would study the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the faint stubble on his jaw, the mole just beside his ear that I'd never noticed before. It was a dangerous, intoxicating form of intimacy, one that existed only in the ambiguous space of his unconsciousness and my silent, watchful wakefulness. Then came the morning that changed the texture of everything. He had spent the night with his head on my chest, a deeper, more settled sleep than I'd ever seen him manage. I had eventually drifted off myself, my body contorted around his, and we'd woken up tangled together in the pale gray light of dawn. He stirred first, blinking slowly, a look of brief, sleepy confusion on his face as he realized where he was. I braced myself for the apology, the awkward laugh, the hasty retreat. Instead, he just looked at me, his eyes still soft with sleep. He pushed himself up slowly, stretching with a groan. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Morning." I managed my own voice a croak. He ran a hand through his messy hair and looked back at me, a small, almost shy smile on his face. "You know," he said, his tone casual, as if he were commenting on the weather, "it's weird. I sleep better when I'm near you." The words hit me not like a thunderclap, but like a profound, vibrating silence. The world stopped. The rain, the traffic outside, the hum of the fridge, it all vanished. There was only his voice, echoing in the sudden stillness of my mind. "I sleep better when I'm near you." It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without artifice or agenda. It was plausible deniability in its purest form. He could have been talking about the ambient temperature, the sound of my breathing, anything. But to me, it was a confession. It was a key, sliding into a lock I didn't even know I was waiting to be opened. I didn't know how to respond. 1,000 replies crowded my throat, clever deflections, earnest questions, a desperate, hopeful me too. In the end, I said nothing. I just gave a small, non-committal shrug, a masterpiece of feigned indifference that cost me everything I had. But the words were out. They hung in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. He had given a name to the ritual, and in doing so, he had given it a new, terrifying power. His statement became a kind of permission slip. The pretense began to fall away. He no longer needed an excuse to fall asleep on me. It was just what he did. But the couch was small, our shared sleep there fragmented and uncomfortable. The ritual was demanding a new venue. It came one Friday night. I was already in my room, getting ready for bed, when a soft knock came at my door. I opened it to find Noah standing there in his pajamas, holding his pillow. He looked exhausted and profoundly uncertain. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is going to sound weird." I waited, my heart beginning its frantic climb. My air conditioner is making this weird clicking noise," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's driving me crazy. I can't settle." I knew his air conditioner was fine. I had been in his room an hour earlier, and it was silent. It was the flimsiest excuse he had ever offered, a transparently thin veil over the real request. He clutched his pillow tighter. "Do you think? Would it be okay if I just slept on your floor? Or something?" He gestured vaguely with his pillow. "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here." My room was my sanctuary, the one place that was unequivocally mine. The darkroom attached to it was the vault where I kept my heart locked away. To let him in, not just to sit, but to sleep, felt like granting him access to the control room. My mind screamed at me to say no, to protect the last boundary. Make an excuse. Say you have to be up early. Say anything. But my heart, that stupid, traitorous organ, said something else entirely. I looked at his tired, hopeful face, and the walls I had spent years building seemed to turn to sand. Don't be an idiot, I said, my voice softer than I intended. You're not sleeping on the floor? I stepped back, opening the door wider. The bed's big enough. It was a queen-sized bed, an ocean of white cotton. He hesitated for a second, then gave me a small, grateful smile that just about broke me in two. He walked in, and the entire atmosphere of my room changed. It was no longer just my space. It was ours. That first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. We lay on opposite edges of the mattress, a vast, arctic expanse between us, our backs turned to each other. I lay ramrod straight, my muscles coiled, listening to the sound of his breathing, every rustle of the sheets a momentous event. I was more aware of his presence in that bed than I had ever been of anything in my life. I don't think I slept for a single minute. But he did. He slept deeply, soundlessly. And in the morning, when he woke up, he looked more rested than I had seen him in months. "Thanks, Liam," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, unadorned gratitude. I slept like a rock, and so, the floor became the bed. The couch became a memory. The new ritual was established. Every night, he would appear at my door, pillow in hand, with a whispered, "Is it okay?" And every night, I would nod and let him in. The chasm between us on the bed began to shrink. It was a slow, geological process. First, it was an accidental brush of his foot against mine. Then, one night, I woke up to find he had rolled over in his sleep and his arm was thrown across my waist. I lay awake for hours, his arm a warm, heavy bar across me, my body electric with a terrifying joy. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just let it happen. The plausible deniability of sleep was still our shield. He was asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. I was just there. I was a passive participant. We were both innocent. But we both knew, in the silent, charged darkness of my room, that we were building something. Or, perhaps, we were just letting something that had been there all along finally take shape. The door to my room, which had once been the symbol of my privacy, my last defense, was now the gateway to our shared world. Some nights he would close it all the way, plunging the room into a deep, comforting darkness. Those were the nights the space between us disappeared completely. The tension had been building for weeks, a low-pressure system gathering strength off the coast, promising a storm. The ritual had become our new normal, but the silence surrounding it was growing heavier, freighted with unspoken questions. The plausible deniability of sleep, once a comforting shield, had worn thin and now felt like a lie we were telling ourselves. We were no longer two friends accidentally falling asleep. We were two people purposefully seeking each other out in the dark, night after night, and pretending we didn't know why. For me, it was a state of suspended animation, a constant, low-grade fever of hope and anxiety. I was living for the nights, for the quiet intimacy of our shared bed, but I was terrified of the day when the sun would rise and we would have to go back to pretending. I was balanced on a knife's edge, and I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Something had to break. The night it happened was quiet, unassuming. It was a Thursday. The air was cool, and a faint smell of rain hung in the air from an earlier shower. We had gone through our evening routine with a kind of subdued reverence. Dinner, a bit of television, the quiet migration to my room. He had closed the door behind him, a soft click that seemed to seal us off from the rest of the world. We settled into bed, the familiar dance of finding our places in the dark. But tonight, the silence wasn't comfortable. It was electric. It hummed with all the things we hadn't said for months. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my back a rigid wall of tension. I could feel him behind me, could feel his wakefulness as surely as I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The space between us was only a few inches, but it felt like a universe of unspoken feelings. After a long, taut silence, his voice came out of the darkness, soft and hesitant. "Liam." My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't turn over. "Yeah." I managed, my own voice tight. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear the faint sound of him shifting, the rustle of the comforter. "I can't sleep." The words were the same ones he'd used so many times before, but tonight they sounded different. They weren't a complaint. They were a confession. The air crackled. "I know," I whispered to my pillow. I felt him move again, closer this time. The warmth at my back intensified. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for, I didn't know what. A good night? An apology? A retreat to his own room? Instead, his voice came again, closer to my ear, so quiet it was almost a thought. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. It didn't just tilt. It came to a dead, silent halt. The question hung in the darkness between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was the question I had dreamed of and feared in equal measure for years. It was the end of the ambiguity, the end of the plausible deniability. It was a deliberate step across a line we had both been so careful not to approach. Every self-protective instinct I had screamed at me to deflect, to pretend I hadn't heard, to make a joke. "Don't be stupid, Noah, you're just tired." But my heart, my tired, hopeful, foolish heart, had waited too long for this. The years of buried feelings, of silent observation, of aching proximity, all coalesced into a single, overwhelming surge of relief and terror. He was asking. He wasn't taking, he wasn't assuming. He was asking. He was making himself vulnerable, laying his own confusion and curiosity out in the open, and waiting for my answer. I turned over slowly, the movement feeling monumental, historic. In the almost total darkness, I could just make out the shape of his face, the faint gleam of his eyes. He was so close. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and uncertain. The storm I had been waiting for was finally here, and it was quieter than I could have ever imagined. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself, crumbled into dust in the face of that one, vulnerable question. There was only one possible answer. There had only ever been one. "Yes," I breathed. The word was barely a sound, but it was enough. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if to give me one last chance to retreat, and then he leaned in. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft, tentative, a question in itself. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of discovery. It was gentle and searching and profoundly, achingly careful. It was the feeling of two coastlines, after centuries of slow, inexorable drift, finally, gently, touching for the very first time. I brought my hand up, my fingers trembling, and rested it on his cheek. He leaned into my touch, a small, shuddering breath escaping him, and the kiss deepened slightly, a quiet confirmation passing between us in the dark. It was not an answer to everything, but it was a beginning. It was the end of the silence. It was a promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. The morning after was a landscape of brittle silence. I woke up first, to the pale, watery light of dawn filtering through the blinds. Noah was still asleep, turned away from me, a clear foot of space between us on the mattress. The warmth and intimacy of the night before felt like a dream, a half-remembered fiction. The kiss, which had felt so momentous, so real in the darkness, now seemed fragile, easily broken by the harsh light of day. I lay there, replaying it in my mind, a loop of tentative hope and rising panic. Had it been a mistake? A moment of sleep-deprived, lonely confusion on his part? I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my movements careful, as if I were in the presence of an unexploded bomb. I needed to put space between us, to give him a clear path to retreat if that's what he needed. He woke up about an hour later. I heard the rustle of the sheets from the living room, where I was pretending to read, my stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He emerged from my room a few minutes later, dressed in yesterday's clothes, his hair a mess. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, on the wall, on anything but my face. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice rough. He went straight to the kitchen, poured a coffee, and stood by the counter, his back to me. The silence was a physical entity in the room, a third presence, suffocating and cold. The easy comfort we had built over years, the new, charged intimacy we had discovered just hours before, it was all gone, replaced by this thick, unbearable awkwardness. "I've got to, get to the office early," he said, still not turning around. Big project deadline. He downed his coffee in 3 quick gulps, rinsed the mug, and placed it in the sink with a clatter. He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door. See you later, he threw over his shoulder, and then he was gone. The front door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing the finality of a cell door locking. I stood in the middle of the living room, the book I hadn't been reading fallen to the floor. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by a sudden, icy wave of humiliation and hurt. I had been a fool. I had mistaken a moment of weakness for a moment of genuine connection. He was confused and lonely after his breakup, and I had been a convenient, warm body, a comfort object. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been an experiment, a line he'd crossed out of curiosity and now deeply regretted. The thought was a shard of glass in my gut. The days that followed were the worst of my life. The ritual was shattered. Noah started avoiding me with a brutal, heartbreaking efficiency. He would leave before I woke up and come home long after I had gone to bed, claiming late nights at the office. On the rare occasions we were in the apartment at the same time, he would offer clipped, one-word answers to my questions, his eyes always darting away, looking for an escape. He retreated back into his own room, the door firmly closed. My bedroom, which had become our shared sanctuary, felt cavernous and cold again. The empty side of the bed was a silent accusation. The silence in the apartment was no longer companionable. It was hostile. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of an appliance, seemed to mock the vibrant, living silence we had once shared. I was drowning in it. The pain was a constant, physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was worse than the years of silent pining, because now I knew what I was missing. I had been given a glimpse of a world I had only ever dreamed of, only to have the door slammed shut in my face. After a week of this Cold War, something in me snapped. The hurt had curdled into a kind of desperate, quiet anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, but mostly anger at myself for letting him retreat, for allowing this wound to fester in silence. I was a quiet person by nature, a conflict avoider, an observer. But my pain was greater than my fear. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't go back to pretending. I deserved an explanation. I deserved the dignity of the truth, no matter how much it hurt. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dark living room, on the couch where it had all begun, and I waited. I heard his key in the lock just after midnight. He stepped inside, moving quietly, assuming I was asleep. He stopped dead when he saw my silhouette on the couch. "Liam," he said, his voice startled. "You're still up. We need to talk," I said. My voice was steady, unnervingly calm. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man who knew this was coming, who had been running from it for a week. He didn't move from the doorway. "Look, man, I'm really tired." "No." I cut him off, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel I didn't know I possessed. "No more of that. No more running. You're going to talk to me. Now." I stood up, facing him across the dim room. "What was that, Noah? That night in my room? What was that?" He flinched, finally looking at me, and in the dim light I could see the panic and exhaustion on his face. "You don't get to do that," I continued, my voice starting to shake despite my efforts to control it. "You don't get to ask me that question, and then kiss me like that, and then just disappear. You don't get to treat me like your goddamn teddy bear, something to cuddle when you're lonely, and then throw in the closet when the sun comes up. I am not your experiment. My feelings are not your playground." The words hung in the air, raw and bleeding. He finally moved, closing the door and leaning his back against it, as if he needed the support. He looked utterly defeated. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "I'm such an idiot." I watched him, my anger beginning to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, aching pull of my affection for him. He looked so lost. I crossed the room and sat on the floor a few feet away from him, the fight going out of me. "Then talk to me," I said, my voice gentle now. "Just be honest with me. Why did you run?" He was silent for a long time, his face hidden in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Because I was terrified," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "After Jessica, I felt so empty, unplugged. Nothing made sense. The only thing that felt real, the only thing that felt safe, was being near you. You're quiet, you're calm. It was like an anchor. I started needing it. I started needing you." He took a shaky breath. "And I've never felt that way about a guy before." It didn't fit with anything I thought I knew about myself. It was confusing, and it scared the hell out of me. He looked at me, his gaze pleading for understanding. That night, when I kissed you, I think I was hoping it would prove something. I was hoping it would feel weird or wrong, and then I could just put it in a box and say, okay, that was just a weird grief thing, and we could go back to being friends. But it didn't, I said softly, the statement not a question. He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. No, he whispered. It didn't. It felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that terrified me even more, because I had no idea what to do with it. I had no map for this. So I did the only thing my stupid, panicked brain could think of. You ran, I finished for him. I ran, he confirmed, his voice full of self-loathing. And I hurt you. And I've spent every minute of the last week hating myself for it. The confession settled in the quiet room, a painful, beautiful, cleansing thing. It wasn't an easy answer, and it wasn't a magic fix. But it was the truth. It was honest. He hadn't been using me. He had been just as lost, just as scared as I was. We were two people fumbling in the dark, and one of us had just panicked and run into a wall. In that moment, watching him sit broken on the floor, all my anger evaporated, leaving only a deep, profound empathy. I had spent years hiding my feelings out of fear, and he had hidden from his for a week. His fear was just newer, louder. I closed the small distance between us and sat down beside him, our shoulders touching. He leaned his head against mine, a mirror of all those nights on the couch. But this time, we were both wide awake. This time, there was no pretense. There was only the quiet, fragile truth. The aftermath of his confession was not a sudden, cinematic happily ever after. It was something quieter, more real. It was the slow, careful work of rebuilding. That night, we talked for hours, sitting on the floor of our hallway, the whole apartment a silent witness. I told him everything. I told him about the bonfire on the beach years ago, about the ache I had carried since, about my fear of losing his friendship. I laid my own vulnerabilities bare, matching his honesty with mine. He listened, his expression a mixture of surprise, regret, and something else, something tender and new. He admitted his feelings were a foreign country he was only just beginning to explore, that he was still scared, but that the thought of losing me, of going back to the cold, silent apartment of the past week, was infinitely scarier. We didn't solve everything that night, but we cleared the ground. We tore down the walls of pretense and plausible deniability and stood in the rubble, finally seeing each other clearly. The new normal began tentatively. The next night, he knocked on my bedroom door, just as he used to, but this time there was no pillow in his hands, no flimsy excuse on his lips. He just stood there, looking uncertain. Is it still okay? He asked, his voice quiet. I just nodded and opened the door wider. When we got into bed, the space between us felt different. It wasn't a chasm of fear or a field of tension. It was just space. After a few moments of silence, I felt his hand find mine under the covers. His fingers laced with mine, a simple, definitive gesture. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The contact was a promise. We were starting over, but with intention. The ritual returned, but it was transformed. It was no longer about a desperate, unspoken need for comfort. It was about a conscious, mutual choice to be close. The cuddling was no longer accidental. The kisses were no longer confined to the darkness, but happened quietly in the kitchen while we waited for the coffee to brew, or softly in the hallway as one of us was leaving for the day. Each one was a small act of construction, building a new foundation for us, brick by brick. We learned a new language, one spoken not just in minimalist dialogue, but in shared glances, in the way he would reach for my hand while we watched a movie, in the way I would bring him a cup of tea when he was working late. His extroverted energy began to return, but it was softer now, less frantic. My quiet observation was no longer a defense mechanism, but a way of cherishing the small details of our new life. The architecture of our apartment shifted once more. The doors between our rooms were now almost always open. My darkroom, once my solitary vault, became a place he would come to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist as I worked, his chin resting on my shoulder. We would stand in the quiet red light, watching an image slowly emerge in the chemical bath, the process of something hidden being brought to light, a perfect metaphor for our own story. He was still the man of logic, and I was still the man of light. But we had found a way to merge our worlds, to create a space that was not his or mine, but simply, peacefully, ours. There is a profound and quiet beauty in finding a home in another person. It's not about grand gestures or passionate declarations. It's about the gentle domesticity of a shared morning, the comfortable silence of two people reading in the same room, the simple, grounding knowledge that there is a place in the world where you can be utterly, completely yourself and be met with acceptance and love. It's the peace that comes from no longer having to pretend, from no longer having to hold your breath. It's the quiet certainty that the door you were most afraid to open, the one that led to vulnerability and the risk of ruin, was actually the door to the safest room you've ever known. We had navigated the storm, and the quiet that followed wasn't an emptiness, but a fullness. We had found our equilibrium, not side by side in separate orbits, but together, in a new, shared trajectory. And we began to heal, and to build, in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together.